As twilight shades are falling, lay thee down to sleep, my child, there to dream on angels singing, and no harm shall thee beguile.
First of all, thanks to the Lilburn Trust for funding this project of mine. It has been much more involving and intense project than I was expecting when I set out. The idea is to find and publish a collection of pre-1950 New Zealand art songs, and I'll come to what all that means in a minute. But one of the things that I've found in my research is that I think, and this is my personal opinion, I think that New Zealand music at the moment can be fairly described as before Lilburn and after Lilburn. Douglas was such a seismic force in New Zealand music that we have tended to forget what came before. And it was all part, Douglas, the kind of starting point is Douglas's talk that he gave to music students at the first Cambridge Music School in St Peter's School within the Waikato in 1946, and the talk was published by the Alexander Temple Library, called A Search for Tradition, in which he challenged composers, the young new generation of composers, who at that stage included people like David Farquhar and Larry Cruden and Edwin Carr, to find their own distinctive New Zealand voice in composition. And this is very much in keeping with people like poet Alan Curnow, who was doing the same thing in poetry. And they both belonged to this fantastic confluence of people who were in Christchurch in the 1930s, that included painters and writers and poets and musicians, which a group that really had such a profound effect on the arts in New Zealand once they kind of were in positions of responsibility and were able to influence what happened. And that meant in very many ways that what happened before, as I said, what happened before their time was superseded by the new. And things like poetry, there was a book that Alan Curnow loathed and hated and called Kowhai Gold, which was published in 1929, and it was a collection of New Zealand poets that were the foremost poets of the time, and it became the kind of whipping boy for Alan Curnow. And the second of my book collections is a nod towards that. I've called it the Golden Kowhai collection, which is a nod towards that book of poetry. In the 1940s, we saw the establishment, properly constituted establishment of professional music in this country, with the establishment of the National Orchestra. You had the establishment of things like the Chamber Music Federation. You had things being established, or at least being talked about, like the Ballet Company, like the New Zealand Players, which was the first professional theatre company in New Zealand. So the 1940s, the post-Second World War period, was very much a time where professional arts came to the fore and were being seriously considered for the first time. And that had a great influence on the kind of music that was being composed. It moved out of being the preserve of the amateur, and people began thinking much more about music as, in inverted commas, art. So that's kind of why I established pre-1950. What is art song? Well, I've used a very broad definition of art song that's taken from the definition of German Lieder, which Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann and Brahms and so on established the genre, which is music, which is composition in which the poet and the composer are equal, and the singer and the pianist are equal partners. And though, that definition is a bit hazy in terms of some of the songs I've looked at, this composers writing in New Zealand certainly really didn't have any concept of art song as such. I've certainly looked at music where the poets, in some cases, the poets and are important New Zealand poets, for example, of the period, and obviously settings of well-known English poets and even German poets are there as well. And also looked at music where the demands on the singers and the pianists are quite equal, and some of these composers were quite formidable pianists, and they put their formidable pianistic skills into the writing of these accompaniments. So that's what I've used as term art song. We don't really have a good word in English to describe that kind of music. Defining what a New Zealand composer is also a bit fraught. If you go back to the 19th century, people who were writing music on the whole, everybody was a foreigner, everybody was an import to New Zealand. And as it turned out, and it was no conscious decision on my part, the composers have divided into three equal lots. The first lot is the musicians who came to New Zealand. Most of these were professional musicians. They came here as organists, as choir masters, as teachers, taking positions in the universities. And the second group that I've arrived at is New Zealand-born men who, some of whom had careers in kind of ancillary music activities, but a number of whom went on to have very distinguished careers in other areas. And then the third and equal group is women. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that there are so many women composers, because after all, they have always been the backbone of music making in this country. They have been the teachers, piano teachers, singing teachers. They have been the accompanists, excuse me, they've been the accompanists. And the thing that I am very surprised about is actually how well musically educated a lot of these women are. And I'm going to introduce you to some of my new friends, because I like to think of them as my new friends. The songs in the collection, and this is the first volume, which is still not quite ready because I'm waiting for the sound files to go with these. This is what the first volume will look like, and each volume has in it a kind of general historical introduction, and at the back, biographies of the poets and the composers, because I think it's important that the poets are represented as well as the composers. And then they will, the books will then have CDs attached to them. I've had a small number of these printed, and then they'll be going to SOUNZ, who will then be responsible for selling to all those music teachers and singers out there who want these songs, and they'll be available as both digital downloads and as actual hard copies. I should say that the start of this project was spurred by the fact that I'd been talking to singing teachers and singers who were saying that there was not a lack exactly, but there wasn't enough New Zealand material for them to perform, and that kind of piqued my curiosity, and I thought about this several years ago, and it just wasn't the right time for me personally to be doing it, but I had come into the Alexander Turnbull to have a look at what was there to see if, in fact, there was enough material that I could do a project like this. And you know, I've been extremely grateful to the National Library, and particularly Michael Brown and Keith McEwing, for their help in negotiating and around all the stuff that's in the National Library and the Alexander Turnbull Library, to find this stuff. You know, there was a period where almost daily I was getting an email from Michael saying, "Oh, you try, have a look at this file. There might be something interesting in this file." And I have to say that while the majority of the stuff that I've included so far, most of it is unpublished, but there is some stuff that has been previously published. I have gone into other collections, like the Hocken Library in Dunedin, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But also, you know, just last week I got contacted by a woman who said, "I've got all my father's music here. Come and have a look at it and see if there's anything that might be interested." So it just keeps on happening. And the other thing that I think is really important for me to stress about this is not an exercise in historical discovery. I'm not trying to encompass every genre of song that was ever written in New Zealand. What I'm doing is providing a resource for singers and singing teachers to provide music material. And that has made a difference in terms of some of the decisions I made about what to include and what not to include. One thing I was never going to include is the patriotic songs, the war songs. There's a thing called the, I better get the name of this right, I think it's called the Archive for New Zealand Music, which is a privately run trust. And they've got 1,700 pieces of New Zealand music, which is published, most of it just published, of which there are 500 songs alone about the First World War. And if you think about that, that's probably 3 a week for the duration of the war of these songs that were being published. And so that, and there are a number of kind of rah-rah, isn't New Zealand great songs, look at this jewel sitting in the middle of the Pacific type of songs. I wasn't interested in those kinds of songs. I was not interested in what might be called the Victorian or Edwardian parlour songs, which are sentimental ballads of poetry of dubious quality and music of even more dubious quality. I wasn't interested in the kind of songs that Auntie Flo might have written, you know. And I was not interested in the kind of religious, the sacred songs. I think there used to be a category in competitions of sacred songs. It's not because I don't think there aren't good songs there, it's just if I'm putting together a collection for modern people to sing, that kind of repertoire is just not something that people are that interested in anymore. We live in a much more secular society. It's not to say that there aren't examples of those kinds of songs in the collection, I just hope that I've chosen some of the better ones. And this comes as covers a kind of cross-section of the composers that are included in the volume. Starting on the far side there, James Philpott. James Philpott was a Welshman who came to New Zealand in, let me just check my notes, 1884, and he came as an organist and choir master. He was a member of and conductor for the Auckland Sandwich Club, and he was a Mason. And though he composed mostly church music, part songs and patriotic songs, it is also thought that he arranged and perhaps even wrote several Maori songs which were published under the name Hemi Piripata. There's only one of his songs, but I'm just using him as an example of a professional musician who came to New Zealand. But Dr. Thomas, William Thomas, came to Auckland University as the first professor of music at Auckland University. He arrived in 1900. He again was performed as a conductor outside of these university duties. Not a very good conductor if you read some of the reviews of some of his concerts. He was evidently a very shy man, and at the end of his time at the Auckland University, he became a bit of a recluse. And some wag suggested that at his farewell party, he'd wear a name tag so people would know who he was. Owen Jensen, who was a well-known broadcaster and music critic for Evening Post in Wellington for a long time, and actually the only composer that I actually personally knew who will be included in this collection, wrote of him. He said, from those of his compositions I knew, a mass and several part songs, he must have been a dull composer, even among the dull Victorians, or the duller ones anyhow, but it was impossible not to like him. There's one of his songs, which was probably written before he arrived in New Zealand, in the collection. This fine photograph here of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, I think, although it's not our history as such, it just, I think, displays the whole thing about black African history. One of those gentlemen is a singer called Moses Hamilton Hodges, and I suspect his wife is there as well, but this photograph has no names on it. Now, the Fisk Jubilee Singers were a group, or actually several groups, from Fisk University, which was one of the very first universities set up in Nashville to educate black students. And the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who were established in the school was established in 1866, and the Fisk Jubilee Singers were established in 1871, and they formed these performing groups which went out literally around the world, and it was partly to help raise funds to maintain the university. And they did several tours of Australia and New Zealand, and Hamilton Hodges arrived with them in New Zealand in 1892, and he decided to stay. And he lived initially in Auckland, and then he and his wife joined him. They set up a singing studio in Wellington, and he became the go-to baritone for choral societies. He was obviously a very fine singer, and he did several tours around New Zealand singing, and as I said, he would pop up all over the country singing the bass solos and Messiah and Elijah and whatever else was needed. And again, I think it says something about black history, or lack of it, that nobody actually knows exactly when he was born, and nobody knows exactly when he died. He returned to America in 1926, so he was in New Zealand about 30 years. And I've read some reports that say he died in 1927, and others that say he died in 1930. And as I said, you've got no idea which of these fine-looking gentlemen is actually Moses. There's one song of his that's included in the first collection, and it actually comes from one of those Edwardian books that ladies had, particularly ladies, where they would write out their favourite pieces of music. And one of these songs, a lullaby, was written, or at least has the name Hamilton Hodges at the top of it. And that was dated 1904, although whether that's when she started the collection and it went on for several years. And there's even a possibility that he actually didn't compose it, but he sang it. But anyway, I like to think that he composed it. Three of my favourite ladies. Starting on the left, Te Rangapai is most well known for having composed Hine e Hine. She was a classical concert singer who had quite a successful career in Britain. She came from a very musical family with four sisters, all of whom sang. She was a contralto in those days, a contralto. And her husband, when she was in Britain, her husband died and she became very ill, and so she moved back to New Zealand. And in 1906, which is when this program comes from, in 1907, she kind of did a farewell tour around New Zealand and then retired. And once she'd retired from singing, she began writing songs, some of which were published in Britain. And I've actually found one song that is still in autograph that will be included in one of the future volumes. Alice Mackay is in the middle here. There were two people who graduated with a Bachelor of Music in 1901, and she was one of them. So she's the first woman to have graduated with a Bachelor of Music in New Zealand. She had 3 husbands, and Mr. Mackay was her last husband. Her maiden name was Rowley, and she had quite powerful benefactions. Sir George Grey was an early encourager of her, and he encouraged the publishing of her first piece, which was called Henry Noah, which was a piece for piano. And she started studying at Canterbury University. She lived in a household with a grandmother and 4 maiden aunts, and she eloped with Mr. McLean, who was 32 years older than she was, partly just thought to get away from a house with a grandmother and 4 maiden aunts. And I think the maiden aunts were very miffed because, of course, he was much closer to their age than her age. But the extraordinary thing, he was a farmer and he had a farm in Ashburton, but the extraordinary thing for me is that she continued her studies at Canterbury University, having children. She had 2 daughters, and through Michael I've been in contact with one of her 92-year-old granddaughters who lives in a home in Huia, and I've also been in correspondence with one of her great-granddaughters. But she had a family, she worked on the farm, and she travelled up to Christchurch once a month to continue her music studies, which I think for the period of time, I mean, she married in 1892, so it was really quite an extraordinary, and that given the constraints of society at the time, that her husband actually encouraged her to keep doing so. Well, after he died, the following year, he died in 1907, the following year she remarried, and she married a Mr. Forrester. And then after he died, she was a widow for 11 years, and then her last husband was Mr. Mackay. Now, Mr. Mackay was the brother of the New Zealand poet Jessie Mackay, and Alice had been setting Jessie Mackay's poetry for some years, so it's more than probable that they met through Jessie. One of the sets of songs that she wrote using Jessie Mackay's poetry was called Maori-land, and it's a collection of 6 songs. And Maori-land was a very common term, and that arose partly at that period. Australia and New Zealand were kind of regarded as one conglomerate, and partly to differentiate themselves, New Zealand developed this concept of Maori-land, and using nature and the nobility of the Maori race to define how we were different from Australia. And at the time, of course, it was thought that the Maori were a dying race, and there was this kind of activity to help preserve this dying race, of which Charles Goldie's paintings were one, and Alfred Hill, who you won't really hear mentioned today, he would sit with Charles Goldie's sitters and copy down their songs, and that's largely where he got his collections of Maori songs from. But the Maori-land aesthetic is this kind of nostalgia for a romantic past, And I want to play, if I can get all this properly sorted out, a song from the Maori-land collection. And the 6 songs kind of cover the gamut of defining what Maori-land was. One of the songs is called Te Whenua Kura, which is actually quite a moving song about the loss of Maori-land, which I think is actually, when you consider when it was written, which was 1914, 1915, it's quite a strong political statement at the time. One is about sheep farming. One is about, there's a very powerful song about a wife watching her husband go off to the First World War, and the ship being surrounded by this cloud of dead babies. It's quite a spooky song, but it was the concern that was widely expressed about sending all these men off to war and the consequence of children not being born. And then there's this one which sums up the bush, New Zealand bush.
Glory of green, oh, the dark shine of it, honey, full wine of it, ring for me, bellbird of our on the pine, ring for me, sing for me. Say, will you bring for me? Say, will you bring for me back the green glamour, back the green glamour, back the green glamour of days that were mine. Glory of green, glory
That
of
just gives you a brief idea about it. One of the reasons why Alison Mackay is so important is because she was so prolific. And she continued throughout her life to write songs. With many of the women, you find that they wrote songs when they were young, then went off and did wifely and motherly duties, and then came back to writing songs again later in life. But she continued throughout her life, and in fact, her last song was published the year that she died, in 1940. And May Waikato is most famous for having written Now Is the Hour, but she did publish several songs that were published in English and Maori, which itself was quite interesting. And one of the great performers of her songs was actually Te Rangipai. So the published versions are all very low-keyed. So in my edition, I have bumped them up in keys a little bit to make them less contralto-ish. The interesting thing with them was that the Maori doesn't fit with the notes so well, so I sent them to Robert Weremu in Auckland, who is the singer and a Maori language expert, and said, help me with these, can you please fit the Maori to the notes more accurately, and also I don't think the Maori is entirely accurate in places, so can you do something to help tidy all that up? And he did, which was a great help. This is a very interesting little social collection here, and it just shows how intimate the Wellington music scene could be. Bernard Page was an Englishman who arrived as the second Wellington city organist, and the first one to be in charge of the new organ that was installed in the newly opened Wellington Town Hall. He gave extremely popular recitals, especially amongst the women, because he was quite a hunk. Vera Beecham, of course, is the oldest of the Beecham girls, and she was Catherine Mansfield's sister, and she and Catherine wrote 2 songs on the voyage between New Zealand and England when they were going off for finishing school. To be honest, they are juvenilia, and they're really only interesting because it's settings of Catherine Mansfield's poetry done by her sister, and there is no evidence that Vera ever wrote another note in her life. But the songs were published in Europe, probably paid for by Daddy, and they are interesting. I mean, they are interesting of their types. Nearest me, Arnold Trowell, who was called Tom. He was a cellist. He was born in Wellington. His father taught Catherine Mansfield the cello, and Catherine Mansfield decided she was going to be a cellist. And she was madly in love with Arnold Trowell. And I think one of the songs, which a copy in the Auckland Public Library is actually dedicated, a handwritten dedication from Catherine to Tom, which is all about love me, love me, love me. He is an example of a New Zealand-born musician who went overseas and didn't ever come back to New Zealand because he was a professional cellist, and there was simply no way he would earn a living in New Zealand. He at one time he was regarded as second only to Pablo Casals as a solo cellist, and he eventually became a teacher of one of the London music colleges. He had a twin brother called Garnet, who was a violinist, and the 2 of them travelled together. They both, in fact, travelled to Europe at about the same time as the Beecham set off for London. And in fact, Harold Beecham actually paid for some of the music education for the 2 Trowell brothers in Europe. And then they both came back to the Trowells, having completed their studies, and the Beechams again arrived back in Wellington at around the same time. And then Arnold and Garnet went back to Europe to start their professional careers. And I don't think it's coincidental that Catherine followed a few months later. Catherine, having had no luck with Arnold, had an affair with his brother, and she had a miscarriage by that relationship. How Bernard Page fits into this picture is that the 2 songs that I've included in the collection are dedicated to Jean Beecham, who was the youngest of the daughters. He was a married man with children. She was 20, and these 2 songs are extremely, for 1914, extremely suggestive, and it kind of raises the question of what was this married man doing, dedicating these 2 risque songs to this 20-year-old girl. But I think it just shows the kind of wonderful social milieu. Claude Hayden was an Australian composer who arrived in New Zealand in 1920. He and his mother and his sister came to Wellington when his sister became principal of Queen Margaret College. When his sister got married and moved back to Australia, Claude and his mother stayed in New Zealand and actually lived in Lower Hutt. And he became a very well-known teacher. And he, again, is a prolific composer, and there's a lot of his songs in the Alexander Turnbull Library. There's a fantastic volume that is just his workbooks, basically, that start it's a period that goes from 1932 to about 1935, where he just wrote songs after songs after songs, or piano pieces, or and thank God for once he's a composer who dated things. Because one of the problems, of course, is actually most of the music isn't dated at all. And you can see that there were kind of weeks where he'd write one song a day. And it's quite an amazing collection. I'll come to Paul Schramm in a minute. Alexander Aitken, in fact, was one of New Zealand's best-known mathematicians. He became Professor of Mathematics at Edinburgh University. He worked at Bletchley Park during the Second World War on the Enigma. And he composed when he was, this is his First World War uniform. He composed as a young man, and there's no indication that he ever composed after that. But the song, which I don't have, that I don't have a recording of, is an extraordinary song for a young man to have written in pre-First World War. It's very adventurous musically and quite not what you'd expect compared to other songs that were being written at the period. He wrote a book called From Gallipoli to the Somme, which is a memoir of his experiences in the First World War, which I saw in Whitcoulls the other day. It's just been republished. It was only published in 1963, a long time afterwards. But the other story about Alexander Aitken is he took his violin with him to the First World War. It got abandoned in the trenches, but eventually found its way back to him in Dunedin, and is now in pride of place at Otago Boys High School, which he attended. Paul Schramm is an example of a musician, a professional musician who came to New Zealand, who New Zealand didn't treat very well, and then he left. That is a wonderful, wonderful postcard of him, and Helen Barnett is his granddaughter. She came to the first concert and showed me that, and I said, I've got to have a copy of it, so I'm sharing it with you. He was a concert pianist, and he was quite a famous concert pianist in Europe. He was Viennese. He married a Dutch pianist called Dinny, and the two of them came to Wellington just before the Second World War, though they'd originally settled in Indonesia but found the climate too humid, so they came to Wellington. They performed up and down the country. They broadcast. They performed a lot in schools. But when the Second World War started, they were stopped from doing that as enemy aliens. So he started driving taxis, and then his taxi license was revoked. So he ended up working in a factory. After the Second World War, he applied for New Zealand citizenship, which was turned down. The reason he was told was that he hadn't fought war bonds. But there's now evidence that he was turned down on the grounds that he had very open socialist leanings, and there was quite an anti-feeling, including in the music community, towards him. So he said, "Bugger you, New Zealand," and he moved to Australia in the hopes to start his solo career again, but it never went very far. His wife and son stayed in New Zealand, and Denny became quite an influential piano teacher in Wellington. I think you knew her, didn't you, Peter? Yeah. But Paul's career never took off, and he was killed in a car crash in Australia where he was selling women's lingerie. Very sad end to the career. But he was actually a phenomenal composer, and I was questioned about why was I including his songs in this collection. For a start, they're in the Alexander Turnbull Library here, but the 7 songs that were included in the first volume really stand the best of what was being written in Europe at the time. And I've run out of time, otherwise I'd play you one, but they are phenomenal, really, really interesting songs. The second volume will include 3 songs that he wrote when he was in New Zealand, and he actually also arranged some of Alfred Hill's Maori songs for performance as well. But he's an example of somebody who came to New Zealand, as there were a lot of Europeans who arrived that we didn't treat very well, particularly in the professional musicians, because there was no place for them in New Zealand. New Zealand didn't understand them, basically. This is my Dunedin gallery. Warwick Braithwaite like Arnold Trowell, went to London to study music, became a professional conductor. He came back to New Zealand as a music director of the National Orchestra. He was a bit of a prickly man, but he wrote 5 songs. He was a composer, he wrote 5 songs, and all of his 5 songs will be in my collection. Mildred Carey Wallace was an extremely glamorous young lady from Dunedin. She met Charles Bayetz, who was the editor of the Triad magazine. He was a lot older than she was, but they started an affair. And when Bayetz's wife wouldn't give them a divorce, they moved to Sydney and lived there in perfect domestic harmony, and she gave birth to a son while they were there. But you'll notice that she died when she was 20. And Charles decided, she was a pianist and a singer and what was called an elocutionist. And Charles decided he was going to promote her career in America. So they set off from Sydney to America, but she got influenza and died on the ship and is actually buried in Samoa. And so she composed very little. And I knew she'd written 3 songs, and tracking them down was quite a feat. I knew they'd been published, and the British Library is the only place that has a public collection of them. And of course, trying to get anything out of Britain in the last year has been extremely difficult, but I have got her songs, so they will be included. And that literally, each of the 3 songs is a page long, so they're very short. Doris Prentice, I like to think of as my discovery. She had 3 published songs called 3 New Zealand Bird Songs, and I couldn't find out anything about her at all. They were actually published under the name Doris A. Prentice, and I wondered whether A. Prentice was a pseudonym. But the poet on them was Charles Allen, who was a Dunedin writer and poet. And I didn't manage to find out about him, and he had, there's a collection in the Hogan Library in Christchurch, in Dunedin, that has his stuff. And I emailed them and said, do you know anything about Doris? Can you tell me anything about Doris? And I got Amanda Mills down there, almost emailed back immediately and said, oh yeah, we've got a whole collection of this, and she sent me, for which much thanks, she sent me about a dozen unpublished Doris Prentice songs. And I love them because they are so quirky. They are so not what you'd expect at the time. I mean, they're not radical in any sense, but they have this wonderful, and I think Charles Allen did have this kind of wonderful irony and kind of sense of humour just under the surface of it. So I included the 3 bird songs in the first volume, and we'll be including more of her songs in future volumes. But I think she's a composer that's well worth rediscovering, and that's what this is about. It's rediscovering lost treasures, which is why the first volume was called Call of the Huia. It's lost treasures, lost treasures, finding stuff that is actually not worth forgetting, that is interesting for people to perform. And the songs range from songs that students can perform through to things like the Paul Schramm songs, which you need bloody good pianists to play and bloody good singers to sing. So, thank you. I know I've gone over time. It's just, talking too much. But, but there's so much to discover, there's so much to find, and so much I hope that people today will get enjoyment out of. So thank you very much for being so keen, and my apologies for going over time.